This is Lesson 2, Who is the Leader of This Family? In our series on the story of Joseph, we'll be looking at Genesis chapter 37, verses 12 to 36. If you have a Bible nearby, I encourage you to follow along. Last week, in the opening scene of Joseph's story, we learned a lot about him, and in just a few verses. The picture was not pretty, but God is committed to transforming him by taking him on a journey he'd never have chosen to go on. The same is true for us. So often, we'd never choose the path that God chooses for us. We return to his story, verse 12, chapter 37. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem, and Israel, this is Joseph's father, more commonly known as Jacob, said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them." Shechem actually posed a threat to Jacob's family. 3 chapters earlier, 2 of his sons, Simeon and Levi, attacked it, brutally killing every male because one of them had raped their younger sister, Dinah. The Bible really is a book about the way life really is. Back to the story. "Very well," he replied. So he, that is Jacob, said to him, Joseph, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron, which is about 50 miles from Shechem, which is also interesting that at the very beginning of the very long journey that God is going to take Joseph on, he literally has to go on a very long journey, a walk of 50 miles. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?" "They've moved on from here," the man answered. "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. As you'll see in the coming weeks, the author loads this narrative with dramatic irony. There are 3 examples in this conversation alone. First, Joseph is safer all by himself in Shechem than he will be with his own brothers. Second, wandering around and overhearing conversations are part of God's plan. Finally, when Joseph says, "I am looking for my brothers," and the author notes Joseph went after his brothers, this anticipates climactic moments later in his story when Joseph looks for his brothers, goes after his brothers, and ultimately finds his brothers. The story continues in verse 18. "But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him." How did they know it was him from so far away? Was it the way he walked? Did he wave? Did he call out, "Hey guys, guess what I dreamed last night"? Not likely. Instead, it must have been the robe, the one their father had given him, the ornate and perhaps colorful robe that caused them so much grief, because it proved what they intuited: their father loved Joseph more than all of them combined. "Here comes that dreamer," they say to each other, identifying him by their resentment of him. Do you ever do that? Do you ever primarily identify others by your resentment of them? "Come now," they say, "let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." Cain offers the same murderous invitation to his brother Abel in Genesis 4. "Come now" is Joseph's brother's version of Cain, "Let's go out into the field, Abel. Come now, let's go to where I will take your life away from you." Do you ever do that? Not literally, but do you ever assassinate others in your heart? Ever have imaginary conversations where you stick it to the one you resent? There's more of us in this story than we might want to admit. Then one of them, the oldest of the 12, intercedes for Joseph. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into a cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. So much irony in this story. For example, how exactly do you throw someone in a cistern but not lay a hand on him? The author here also reveals Reuben's intent. He said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. At first it seems heroic, but there's a problem with Reuben's plan. Even though he is the oldest, which meant future leader of the family, he lost his credibility to lead, especially with his father. Back in chapter 35, verse 22, while Israel was living in that region, Reuben went in and slept with his father's concubine, Bilhah, and Israel heard about it. And you think your family is dysfunctional. So let's pause and meet them. God's holy and chosen family. The father Jacob had 2 wives, Rachel and Leah. He loved Rachel with all his heart, Leah not so much. But it was Leah who gave Jacob 6 of his 12 sons. And as you might imagine, this created a bit of tension between the two because Rachel was barren. Their animosity toward each other spilled over on 2 separate occasions, but for different reasons. Rachel, because she couldn't have any children. Leah, because she couldn't have any more children. To spite each other, they gave their respective servants, Bilhah and Zilpah, to Jacob so that he could have more sons. And I'm sure Jacob loved this idea. As a man, more sex. As a landowner, more free labor. You can read all the sordid details in chapter 30 of the book of Genesis. Suffice it to say, Jacob ends up with 12 sons from 4 different women. The oldest 4 are sons of Leah, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. They're followed by 2 sons of Bilhah, Rachel's servant, Dan and Naphtali. Next come 2 sons of Zilpah, Leah's servant, Gad and Asher. And then in a surprising turn of events, God grants Leah the ability to conceive again. Can you imagine how this made Rachel feel? And she gives birth to Issachar and Zebulun. Finally, and I mean finally, in her old age, God remembers Rachel and enables her to conceive a son, who is, you guessed it, Joseph. 6 sons for Leah, 2 sons for Bilhah, 2 sons for Zilpah, and 1 son for Rachel. But that equals 11, not 12. 5 chapters later, Rachel dies while giving birth to Benjamin, the 12th and final son of Jacob. Now, why is this important? Why go into all this detail? Because a very important question in Joseph's story, perhaps the question, is who is the leader of God's family? Tradition says the oldest, but Reuben, as we've already noted, lost his title to lead when he had sex with his father's concubine. The next 2 sons in line, Simeon and Levi, lost their opportunity when they maliciously murdered the males of Shechem, an act motivated by revenge, not justice. Which means leadership of God's family falls all the way down to Judah, who right on cue is about to enter Joseph's story. But before we get to Judah, we need to return to Reuben and ask a question. What motivated him to try and rescue Joseph? Skipping ahead to verse 29, we read, when Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He then went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" And it's this question of where can I turn now that reveals Reuben's desire to rescue Joseph actually had nothing to do with rescuing Joseph. Reuben wants to rescue Reuben. Yes, he wants to rescue Joseph, but he wants to do so in order to rescue himself. He's motivated by self-interest. His logic worked something like this. Joseph is clearly Dad's favorite. Maybe if I rescue him from my brothers, he'll forgive me for having sex with Bilhah and restore me as the future leader of the family. But if you know part of the story, Reuben would not even get a chance to rescue Joseph because of what happens next, which also reveals a curious detail that the author leaves out. Where was Reuben when his brothers sold Joseph into slavery? That's when the darkness descends. Verse 23, as their evil plan begins to unfold. When Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. This is loaded with meaning, since the robe represented why they hated him. It also appears that they're following Reuben's leadership. They don't shed any blood, which is what Reuben warned against. Nonetheless, their actions would have still led to Joseph's death, either by drowning, if there had been water in the cistern, or by starvation over a long period of time. There's a bottom line in their motive. They're committed to his death. And this tragic scene reveals they're even committed to a slower and more painful kind of death. Of course, the moment they threw Joseph into the cistern, we can only assume that Reuben disappeared. What they do next provides a window into the darkest, deepest place of their souls. They sat down to eat a meal. They actually engage relationally. They connect. Perhaps they even celebrate. I have a toast, one of them may have boasted, to the dreamer who we've finally gotten rid of. Have you ever toasted someone else's downfall? Is there a dreamer in your life that you just as soon get rid of? But remarkably, it's at this dark moment that God enters the story. But in a way, no one could ever recognize him, which is often how God enters stories, including our own. They looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. It's also here that Judah enters the story. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. Come, let's go." There it is again. "And not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." I mean, can you feel the evil? As Judah offers up, as a concession no less, after all, come on guys, he's our brother. Right on the heels of saying, "Come, let's sell him." But perhaps even more chilling, it is with this utterly wicked idea that the leader of God's family is revealed. It's Judah. His brothers agree. This is the kind of leader that they will follow. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. Now pause. Consider what Joseph felt as he was being pulled up out of that cistern. I'm sure he felt relief. They've finally come to their senses. I'm sure he felt gratitude. I'm not going to die. I'm sure he felt the need to make certain promises regarding the future. I will never tell on them again. I'll never wear that robe again, and I hope I never have another dream. But at some point, maybe it was when he faintly heard a foreign language being spoken, or maybe when he saw currency being exchanged. The moment he climbed out of the cistern, he's handed over to something so much darker. He likely went into shock. The trauma of being bought, sold by your brothers, your own flesh and blood. 20 shekels of silver. It was the going rate for a slave back then, which means there's nothing special about the amount, but it's still significant. At this point in Joseph's story, there's no longer anything special about him. The scene then dramatically shifts to the cover-up operation his brothers engage in to close the loop with their dad. The pace of the story picks up considerably. They got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, dipped the robe in the blood, took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." And notice how they refer to Joseph not as our brother, but your son. He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph surely has been torn to pieces." Old Testament scholar Bruce Waltke observes, "As Jacob deceived his father Isaac with the skins of a goat and his brother's clothing, he is now deceived with the blood of a goat and his son's clothing. Because in God's family, what goes around always comes back around." Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, and this isn't in the text, but think about that. For their sons, for his sons, this was the height of hypocrisy. But he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. That's the end of this scene. And what I'd now like to do to close it is go back to the question, who is the leader of this family? In the opening scene, you'll remember, Joseph has two dreams that reveal he will be the leader, but right now Joseph can't be the leader. He's not the oldest. In fact, he's next to the youngest. The oldest is Reuben, but he lost his credibility to lead, as did the next two, Simeon and Levi, which means Judah. But it can't be Judah. He's entirely unqualified to lead. Wait till you see what he does in the next chapter. And yet, functionally speaking, he is the leader because his brothers follow him. I want to close by going back to Reuben, though, because to me, he's the most interesting character in this scene. His rescue attempt is motivated by self-interest, which I can relate to. Is that true of you? Have you ever tried to rescue someone else in order to really rescue yourself? And in particular, I want to return to the moment he comes back to the cistern when he discovers that Joseph's not there. He's obviously distraught. He tears his clothes. He returns to his brothers and exclaims, "Where can I turn now?" Imagine that feeling of desperation. The last chance you have to redeem yourself is gone. But now also ask yourself, is there really nowhere else he could have turned? Is there really nothing else that he could have done? I believe there's an aha moment in this scene, and it comes as you realize there is something else Reuben could have done, but self-interest isn't ever enough to motivate anyone, us included, to make the kind of sacrifice Reuben could have made. The moment he realized his brothers had sold their brother into slavery, he should have confronted them. Then he could have challenged them to join him on a rescue mission to save Joseph. But that would have required a lot of courage, an act of incredible bravery. And Reuben just didn't possess it. We don't either, if we're honest. Reuben was willing to risk his reputation, to rescue himself, but he wasn't willing to risk his life to rescue his brother. Now, what about you? Are you like Reuben, lacking courage? Motivated by self-interest, committed to your own safety, to saving yourself? Or do you long to be different? You see, the kind of courage we all long for is the kind Jesus demonstrated on his rescue mission to save us. In contrast to Reuben, Jesus is full of courage. He's motivated by self-sacrificing love, not self-interest. He's so committed to you that he bravely gave his life for you to save you. And not only does he have the ability to save you, he has the power to transform you. to be more like him and less like Reuben, it comes down to this. Do you want to be safe or do you want to be brave? If you want to be brave, ask Jesus to get the Reuben out of you. Amen.